So let's just wait for the audience just to join us.
Good morning.
Yeah,
Is it
good morning.
It's afternoon where you are, I suppose.
That's afternoon. That's 1 o'clock in Oman, and in Iran that's 12:30. Are you
Okay.
okay, Prof? You're okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah.
What about your back? Just no problem with that?
It's a long-term problem, I'm afraid. I had a new physiotherapist to see things and recommend things 2 days ago, and that was useful, but nothing decisive, I'm afraid, in terms of being able to eliminate pain.
Okay.
Which is a bit of it's a real worry, actually.
The good news is that there is no need for surgery. That's perfect.
Yeah, that's true. On the other hand, apparently the two types of damage are integrated with each other. And if it was only one, it would be much easier to try to eliminate the pain, apparently. But
okay.
When are you, I mean, this is with your students watching live, is that right?
Yeah. They will just join us, Prof. They will join us in a moment, one by one. Just I cannot see
What level are they?
Just they are PhD holders, MA holders, mostly are.
MA course.
Yeah. Just to understand,
How is their listening comprehension in English?
That's good, Prof. That's good. Don't worry about that.
No, okay, but that's reassuring.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Just don't worry.
Omanis have been more exposed to English than Iranians.
Yeah, that's right. Because English in Iran is a foreign language.
Yeah, I know.
Not a
when
second
Hossein Davari came and spent 3 months at my institution, he could speak. Can you hear?
Yeah. Just again, who said? Who was the name?
Was it Hossein Davari? I think his name was.
Okay.
He had 3 months at my institution.
Oh.
He could say a lot in English very convincingly, but he really wasn't experienced in dialogue in English, which limited his capacity to integrate with other PhD students.
Okay, that's it. So, can we just start, Professor?
Yeah, by all means.
Oh, thank you. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our channel.
Nice to join you.
Okay, today we have the honor of speaking with a distinguished scholar whose work has significantly impacted the field of linguistics and policy making. Professor Robert Phillipson is renowned for his groundbreaking research on linguistic imperialism, a concept that has shed light on the power dynamics inherent in language use and spread. Professor Robert Phillipson, thank you for joining us today. It's a privilege to have you here. To start,
I'm very glad to have the opportunity.
Okay, thank you. Could you provide our viewers with a brief overview of what linguistic imperialism is and how you came to develop this important concept? Before that, to our viewers, please, if you have any questions for Professor Robert Phillipson, feel free to write them in the comment section. We'll make sure that Professor Robert Phillipson will address them in the interview or afterward. Please.
Yeah, I mean, I joined the British Council straight from university and was experienced at language learning. I had very high levels of proficiency in German and English and some Spanish. And then I found myself working with direct teaching of English in Algeria in 1965, just after independence, after a horrible war, of course. And I was very much underqualified there. And then I went back and did an MA, master's degree in Leeds in the United Kingdom in linguistics and English language teaching. But again, the pedagogic dimension was very limited at that time. And that meant that, relatively speaking, my training was to do with classroom skills and the promotion of a particular language, English, but without the whole context within which English was functioning. And that meant that I looked into, for instance, the reasons why English had maintained its dominant position in former colonies, especially the colonies of the British, like Kenya, Nigeria, in Africa, but also in Pakistan and India, and so on. And then it became clear to me that English was being promoted as though it was a completely apolitical task, a tool only, free of any kind of political roles. It was just to do with language proficiency. And my book tried to explain that that was a gross misrepresentation, because in fact, languages are learnt for cultural and political reasons. And obviously this means that they are very functional. If you become very proficient in the language, you can use the language. But the history of post-colonial education, which is what I was looking into very intensively in former British colonies, shows that in those former colonies, English is used by the elites, and when it's used in schools, often the teachers are underqualified, and this means that privilege is maintained when English is used in those ways. And I'm not an expert on the Middle East, although I have twice been in the Emirates and once in Qatar, so I'm very interested in what is happening in that part of the world. I've never been to Iran either.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that one needs to know what kind of agendas there are in place in any given context. So if you like, you can see that linguistic imperialism is based on one concept, linguicism, which was coined by my wife, an eminent scholar in bilingualism, who basically said, look, we have racism, we have sexism, we also have linguicism. Why are not more people speaking
Interesting.
about linguicism? Because linguicism is an instrument by which those who are privileged maintain their dominance. And this means that if English is considered within any given political context, even in, say, in the United States or United Kingdom, or in other parts of the world, one needs to have a pretty clear idea as to whether linguicism is in place, meaning does it represent maintaining privilege, or is it a route of access which is not politically contaminated in any way? And these things are very complex issues once you look at the detail of it in any given context. But the concept linguicism has become well established and is a very powerful, simple way of trying to verify whether injustice is in place by means of language. And this means that linguistic imperialism, in the way that I've tried to theorize it and demonstrate how it is actually working in many contexts, is one way of approaching a profound analysis of the role of English within given contexts.
Okay. Thank you, Professor, for the brief overview of the concept. Just, I have an important question. I think that's very, very important, and maybe we can say that this is in fact the gist of your theory. Professor, your work on linguistic imperialism provides a critical perspective on the global spread of English, highlighting the power of dynamics and equalities it perpetuates, as you rightly mentioned. In contrast, David Crystal takes a more descriptive and neutral stance, viewing the spread of English as a natural linguistic phenomenon driven by historical and economic factors. How do you respond to Crystal's perspective, and what do you see as the key differences in your approaches to understanding the global dominance of English? I mean that you believe, Professor, in the conspiracy theory, but David
Yeah.
Crystal does not believe in that. Please.
Yeah, I mean, Crystal is an eminent linguist, and he's written on lots of topics, and in many ways is a very distinguished scholar. There's no question about that. But he was in the board of the British Council at the time that he wrote a book called English as a Global Language. And the British Council is basically there to promote English worldwide in order to serve British commercial and political and geopolitical interests. And this means that the idea that he is functioning in a neutral way is self-delusional on his part. Oh. And when I looked at his book carefully, it really shocked me that, for instance, he has a coverage of South Africa, and he only mentions English and Afrikaans. He totally ignores 9 African languages, which after the end of apartheid have official status and are used regionally in different parts of South Africa. Mind you, South Africa is a very complex scene, so I want to go into the detail, but in relation to the book, he was simply blind to the diversity that exists in many contexts. And in a way, I think that reminds, well, anyway, I wrote a long review of his book, which I think was in the journal called Applied Linguistics. And this made Crystal very angry because he was so eminent that he wasn't used to being criticized at all. So it came as a big surprise for him. Okay. In a way, it's a shame because obviously analyzing what roles English plays as a global language is a very important topic, just because English is being learnt everywhere. And if I give you another example, I've mentioned former colonies. As soon as communism collapsed in Eastern Europe with the disintegration of the Soviet Union and countries like Poland and Slovakia and Hungary becoming independent states again, basically the British and the Americans immediately moved in lots of experts on English language teaching from the United States and the UK in order to ensure that English replaced Russian as an international language in that part of the world, which had not been the case until then. And this meant that I'm very skeptical about experts on English language teaching if they don't know the language of their learners. And in many cases, people have been trained in the teaching of English worldwide without ever having to learn a foreign language themselves. And that means that I'm very skeptical about the qualifications that particularly British and American organizations, TESOL in the United States, what's the British equivalent? The name will come to me in a moment. But I mean, basically in universities in both parts of the world, the UK and in Australia to some extent as well, are not really using experienced language learners as language teachers. And in good foreign language teaching, foreign language teachers have learnt that foreign language up to a very high level of proficiency, which is presumably the case of your own Professor Reza Bishkar. I don't know how to pronounce your name properly, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
This is the same in Europe. I mean, in continental European countries, Germany, France, Italy, and so on, good teachers of English are people who know the language of their learners and who have themselves gone through the process of learning the language to a very high level of proficiency. And this is not true of large numbers of British or American people who are teaching at universities in the Arab world. And I know this very well from having been twice in the Emirates to give lectures and met a lot of people working there, and also in Qatar. And of course, it's very complicated because internationalization in those places has meant that there are very large numbers of universities from the Western world functioning within that country. And that means that there are also big international schools. And I have no idea what the position is in Oman. But clearly, this means that it's a very different situation because of the complexity of English having a privileged status and some kids from those countries having English medium instruction. But one of the most worrying things of all that I heard when I was last in an emirate country, Sharjah, I think it was basically that the very good teachers of foreign languages, often people from Morocco, teachers of English, from Morocco or from Jordan, were shocked that the English of the students there, locals, was not particularly good, and their Arabic was not well developed either. And that to me is that's a linguicism situation. And that means that the kind of overall educational policy for people in those countries at school level and then in higher education has been made more complex and complicated than it would have been desirable for.
Okay, Professor, just let me clarify my question. Just the point which is important to me is that conspiracy theory, that there is a kind of plot behind that, or that there's a kind of, let's say that manipulation. Could you just talk about any pieces of evidence, concrete evidence that you believe that, okay, there's a kind of conspiracy just to develop that concept, linguistic imperialism?
Yeah.
Any type of manipulation behind doors,
Yeah. One needs to be pretty careful about the context one is talking about. And in that sense, David Crystal, to go back to that, lives in the United Kingdom. He lives in Wales, in fact. But writing a book which is supposed to be summarizing everything worldwide, lots of different countries, is an impossible task. And it's not one that I've ever done in my books. I have, on the other hand, concentrated a lot on living in the part of Europe where I live, which is mainly in Denmark and currently in Sweden as well. So I've been trying for years to concentrate on areas where I'm active myself. And my first book, long before I wrote Linguistic Imperialism, was one that I wrote with two Danish foreign language teachers, very experienced, and it was called Learner Language and Language Learning. And this was based on a vast amount of empirical studies of Danes learning English at the age of 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, all the way through, written data and spoken data, which we then tried to summarize in that book for Danish learners of English as a foreign language. And this means that in that context, it was trying to draw on expertise from the United Kingdom and the United States. And there is, of course, a lot of expertise that is relevant. Or if you like, it is something that might be relevant in other contexts, even it may have been promoted or developed in that way. But this means that we were trying to ensure that we were familiar with the best of what there was in the way of understanding second and foreign language learning, but specifically addressing this for Danish education to strengthen it. And I know the book is still being used after 40 years, which means that obviously it was culturally appropriate, educationally appropriate. And in that sense, the fact that a British publisher, Multilingual Matters, which produces lots of very good books on language learning in lots of different contexts, they actually bought 3,000 copies of that book for the international market. So that to some extent it was also showing what was being done in a very particular context and was meeting local needs. And I think obviously that's what's important in any context. How do you best meet local needs? And this means that in your Oman situation, it's up to Omanis in partnership with outsiders to try to find out what is most appropriate in your local context.
So, Professor, the idea world Englishes, you're familiar with it, I guess, by
Yeah.
Cantrell. So
Yes.
this is a kind of response to linguistic imperialism.
It's funny you should ask that question now, because I learned a lot from Kachru, very definitely. And if you look carefully at linguistic imperialism, you'll see I praise him for pioneer work in identifying the different uses that English was serving in different parts of the world. And he was a brilliant teacher as well. I had a whole week at his university just after Linguistic Imperialism had been published. And I could see how he was functioning as a wonderful teacher, drawing out people's profound questions, who were then working with him over a year or two as MA or even PhD students. So, I mean, I have a lot of respect for what he was doing. But at the same time, I think that people who are from India feel that to some extent he was really dealing with English serving elites in India rather than the needs of the masses of the population in India, which is not surprising, of course. I mean, people with native speaker competence in India are possibly 4 or 5% of the enormous population that there is in that country, with very strong regional languages and hundreds of other languages dotted all around the country. And I think that the research done by Ajit Mohanty and Minati Panda and other people in one region with indigenous peoples' languages, building on what are there called tribal languages. And tribal is not a stigmatizing term in those contexts, whereas it is used in a stigmatizing way in other contexts. His book, called The Multilingual Reality, is trying to show how more people can become competent in their mother tongues and in a regional language and in English if education is organized appropriately. And that's why his book is called The Multilingual Reality, because those people in a country like India live in a multilingual local context as well as a national context, which is multilingual. So Kachru was a pioneer in pointing out in different contexts, one can classify things in three main categories. Some of the criticism which I've read of him is basically saying that this is true as broad generalizations, but it is sociolinguistically not very sophisticated, and that's encouraging people to work through things in their own way, in their own local context, so as to make sure that they're not misled in any way. And I was really joking because yesterday I picked up a copy on a shelf on the other side of the room that I'm sitting in, which is the Oxford Handbook of World Englishes, which is edited by two Finnish scholars. It was published in 2017. Two Finnish professors of English and an Indian scholar who now works in the United Kingdom. And there is a chapter in that book by myself
You're
and
great.
my wife, Tova Skutnab Kangas, which deals with just these issues. And that means that if one is trying to see where language policy, which of course is a much broader term than linguistic imperialism, how language policy functions in the diversity of World English's contexts, then there is a lot of very interesting work being done worldwide, which one can draw on. And interestingly, in that particular chapter, it definitely is, with one half of it relating linguistic imperialism to World Englishes, and in the other half, it is linking English to global ecological context, the factors in the cultures, in the traditional knowledge in woodland, in whether it's a dry country or a wet country, and all those other things, ecological factors, because those are also involved in all contexts where languages are being killed off. extinguished in a huge range of different contexts. But one knows that the colonization by European countries of the world is basically a process of Europeanization, which is what has taken place in Canada, United States, Mexico, with Spanish and Mexican languages, and of course in countries like Australia, where the British were intent on extinguishing all the languages of the Aborigines and tried for a century to do so. And this means that in those contexts, revitalizing the language is a crucial issue for people there who do wish to maintain their languages. And this is true in all contexts worldwide. There are revitalization efforts of indigenous peoples taking place worldwide, meaning also in my local contexts, meaning I live now in Sweden. I've been living in Sweden for 10 years with a wife who had both Swedish and Finnish as mother tongues. And in the far north there, the Sami are the only indigenous people in Europe. And the Swedes and the Norwegians and the Finns, and to some extent a smaller community in Russia or in the Russian Empire, they tried to Christianize those people. They tried to remove their culture and their languages, which is what the British were doing in Canada as well. And this means that those languages have survived, but until the 1970s, 1980s, were very seriously threatened with extinction, whereas this is no longer the case. And in Norway, where there is the strongest community, you can go to kindergarten, to school, to university in the Sami language, or one of the 10 Sami languages. And that means that revitalization of languages is a very exciting thing in many contexts worldwide.
Yeah. Good, thank you. Decolonizing activities, in fact, just to topple that type of, colonizing spread. Just a number of comments here, Professor. I'm going to read. Okay. Just Ali just has mentioned that. Can we say, in accordance with what you have mentioned, that first of all, he has written, Professor, as you have rightly mentioned, good language teachers are the ones who have familiarized themselves with the language of their learners. Can we say, in accordance with what you have mentioned, that translanguaging, the use of native language in teaching, may be a panacea for linguistic imperialism? If yes, how can teachers nullify possible neo-colonial streams that may be present in educational contexts? Because learners in expanding countries, sorry, just there's a kind of, because learners in
there's
expanding
several
countries like
questions in
Iran,
this.
sorry, because learners in expanding countries like Iran are under the delusion that English is far more superior compared to their own language, which is this case would be Farsi. Please.
Yeah. No, and translanguaging is understood in different ways in many different contexts. And to me, it is puzzling that translanguaging is seen as a pedagogical resource, whereas in the kind of upbringing that I had in Europe, translation played a major role. Meaning, until approaches to the spoken language were given a more central place, translation was learned in order to be able to read foreign languages, except in contexts where you had to interact. But this means that in the kind of training that I had in French and German in school, I developed a very sophisticated familiarity with the written language, and I had done a great deal of translation into and from French and German in this context. And I think that it's puzzling that the way translanguaging is being marketed as a pedagogical resource without taking into consideration the role that translation can play in given contexts. And this means that I think that it's incredibly important to see this in local terms. And if I also try to answer your question in the context that I've worked a lot, meaning the European Union, you have 24 official languages for the 27 member states, which have the same status in law, meaning the complex business of the European Union is a mix between a member state and decision making and law making at the European level. And interestingly enough, in the terms of the internal working of the organizations, French was the dominant language for many years when there were only 8 member states, or 6 actually in the beginning, whereas it's infinitely more complex for 27 countries. And I looked into whether linguistic imperialism was taking place in the institutions of the European Union and produced a book on this called English Only Europe, ? Challenging Language Policy. Because it seemed to me that there were risks of linguistic imperialism functioning in the way the French were behaving earlier and the way speakers of English, which mean not only English people or Irish people, but also Scandinavians and the Dutch and others who have a very strong tradition of English learning. And one needs to be extremely careful to see whether or not linguicism is in place or linguistic imperialism is in place in the internal functioning of the organizations there. And I've written a very complex, long article about all of that, where I try, it's called Linguistic Imperialism in the European Union or something like that. But it's trying to go back to the first question of all, meaning neutrality of English and so on, because basically it functions in the European Union with the diversity of languages because there is the largest translation service in the world between all the languages and the largest interpretation processes in the language in all the 24 languages of the 27 member states. And English does have a privileged position in some contexts, but not necessarily an imperialist language, in the sense that provided the Swedes and the Danes and the Dutch and the French ensure the maintenance of their national languages in balance with English, then things are healthy. The language policy is appropriate. And that means that you need to have well-qualified interpreters and translators. And that's why I think it should have a larger role in schools, in addition to whatever communicative language functions. And of course, communication is not only a spoken function, there are written communicative functions as well. And that means that a lot of the marketization of English by the British and the Americans has tended to avoid translation because they know that the teachers that they're marketing worldwide or training, if you go from Malaysia to study in England for 2 years as a graduate student, your Malay language may well be secure because it is still used nationally, but it won't be used in any way in the British learning context.
Professor,
but these are very complex questions. I'm sorry, I may not be answering every detail in all the questions, but I'm trying to point out that you need to clarify the key language policy factors or the key language pedagogy factors that are important in your local context in order to optimize teaching and learning.
Okay, Professor, just because you mentioned translation or translanguaging, what do you think about AI, artificial intelligence? How do you see the future of linguistic imperialism in light of AI? Because there is no need for learning a second language when you can just use AI, artificial ChatGPT can do everything for you. So, what do you think about that?
It's a very important question. Just because AI has now established itself without anyone knowing who was controlling it, which is
Okay.
why governments and international organizations are very much concerned to assess it. The European Union invested in computerization of languages in a very big way in order to have translations done using machinery. And if you tried to use Google Translate 10 years ago, you would get the general idea of what was in the source text, but you wouldn't get a perfect translation. Now, when I use Google Translate between Swedish, which is a language that I've been learning for the 10 years I've been in the country, and English, my receptive knowledge of Swedish is excellent. And if I need to write the language, Google Translate is a very good tool to work with. I've lectured in French in half a dozen countries because my French partly was established at university, initially in England. And then I lived in Algeria, where all of my contacts and friends there had studied in France, which was the elite language in colonial Algeria. And it was only just after independence that I was in the country. So I've lectured in French-speaking countries, 6 French-speaking countries in French. But I haven't used French much recently, except for reading. And that meant that when I needed to give 2 lectures in France last year in November, one at a university, one at an Esperanto Association meeting, I needed to prepare PowerPoints and lectures in French, and going to Google Translate, I did frequently because I could rely on it. It's good enough now, which it wasn't 10 years ago, and because I have a good receptive knowledge of the language. And that means that when I wanted a sentence where I couldn't quite get it out of my own memory, going to Google Translate would then produce what I needed. And I would say to myself, yes, of course, meaning it built on a very good receptive competence in the language to use that tool effectively. But artificial intelligence is never going to take over what is done by translators and interpreters in the European Union organizations. But it may well make for speed. But that's because people have very high levels of competence in all the relevant languages. And that's exactly where artificial intelligence presumably is a sophisticated tool which you're in command of rather than it being in command of you, because that's what the big AI impact is concerned with, meaning who is determining internet communication, which of course is playing a bigger and bigger role in many, many contexts. So I haven't studied it personally, but I know that, for instance, universities in Denmark, which I am in touch with, they're all deeply looking into how far it can be used as a service tool, both in teaching and in learning, but without it interfering with people's thinking, meaning being critical scholars. And in fact, schools in Scandinavia and in Finland, in the 5 Nordic countries, are based on schools learning people to be critical. They're not just supposed to absorb knowledge, they're supposed to train them to think independently. Well, how far this happens or not is, of course, a complex issue. But this means that it's even more the case at university level. But because of mass production of universities, I mean, when I started in university, I think there were probably in the United Kingdom about 6% of the population who were going to higher education. And then the Labour government with Tony Blair tried to get it up to 50%. And the fact that very large numbers of people are now going into higher education is complex, and it's also become a financial issue. It's because universities are being treated as businesses. And this is one of the reasons why I am very skeptical of, for instance, a British university establishing in an Arab country its own university using the language as it is used in the United Kingdom rather than as it is used by Arab users of English, and because the content is British rather than necessarily local or in some sense international. And that means that I think that one needs to be very, very careful in inviting outsiders in if their knowledge of the language and the cultures of the country where you're functioning cannot decide what happens in those institutions within your own country. And that, of course, is exactly what may well be happening in all the Emirates. For all I know, it's possible, but it'll be very uphill because of what they have invited in over the last 20, 30 years.
Okay.
And that's where
thank you.
Oman may be in a bit. I don't know what the position is in Oman, but Iran is obviously in a better position in that sense.
Okay, just
You have very well qualified local people.
Exactly. You're absolutely right. Professor, there's a question for you. Just of course, that's about Persian, and let me just read the question for you. Mr. Sheikhi has posed the question. I need to raise an issue with Persian as the imperialist language in Iran. I would highly appreciate it if you could allow me to speak. Of course, Persian is doing the same thing to languages like Kurdish or Turkish by forbidding education in native language. They have been marginalized, and linguicism is in place here. How do you categorize Farsi and Kurdish in this case? This is, in fact, at the national level, Persian is being spoken by everybody.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
I mean,
Do you
this is
think
a
that they
question.
need? Sorry,
This
Professor.
is a question that is very close to my heart because my wife Tova Skutnap-Kangas was the first person to write books on bilingualism and came from a bilingual background. But she knew that in her own country, Finland, the minority language in the far north was being stigmatized and attempts were being made to eliminate the language. I have lived in Denmark for 40 years before moving to Sweden. And one of the largest immigrant groups is Kurds, mainly from Turkey, but also to some extent from Iran and Syria now, and of course, more in recent years. But clearly those languages, the Kurdish languages in the four main countries in which Kurds live, have been subjected to appalling linguicist policies for generations, right throughout the 20th century. And in the book in my hand, I don't know whether you can see it, in fact.
Yeah, just linguistic human rights. Yeah, it's a postmodern book.
It's a handbook of linguistic human rights. There are other books on linguistic rights, but this is human rights. There is an extremely good chapter in that book by an Iranian Kurd, and it compares the policy vis-a-vis the Kurds in Iran and Turkey and Syria, and in those three countries mainly. And it's very interesting historically because it's obviously trying to document different strategies. And basically, if I generalize very, very crudely, policies in Turkey, and I've twice been to peace conferences which were trying to solve the Kurdish problem within Turkey, with Kurds and Turks who wanted the Kurdish issue to be resolved peacefully. And unfortunately, what the current president of Turkey, Erdogan, has done is to fail to grant further rights, except tokenism, and is treating the Kurds abominably still, horrifyingly. And this means that the policies are crude in Turkey. The policies in Iran, so far as I know, are more subtle, they're more discreet. But it doesn't alter the fact that you can study Kurdish at the universities in Mahabad. Is that right? I think so. You can do a full university degree in Kurdish, but if you wish to employ that in schools, it doesn't work. There are no posts for people in Kurdish. And that means that, relatively speaking, and of course there was a degree of freedom in 1947, 48, a much greater degree of freedom for the Kurds in Iran. Okay. And of course, all of these things are very well documented. And the Iranian, whom I've mentioned as having written an extremely good article in this book. If I have a copy, I will send it to Reza, Professor Reza, because I may or may not have. If not, I have a draft which is not in PDF. But if I can find the PDF of it, I'll send that to you. I'm not supposed to because the publishers don't want that. But I mean, I'm willing to do it in any case. I'm so old it can't affect my life, I don't think.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Let me ask you another question.
These are very important, and I want to mention one other thing. There's a brilliant Kurdish Iranian whom I have known very well. He died tragically 10 years ago, Amir Hassanpour, and his wife is a Farsi speaker. And I have been in their flat or house twice in Canada. And obviously there are marriages of that combination there, just the same as there are marriages between Serbs and Croats, traditionally in Yugoslavia. But there is an enormous resource at the University of Toronto of Kurdish materials. And this is because Amir Hassanpour spent decades documenting all of that. And his wife is still working hard on this. She's just on the point of retirement from the university, but there is a fantastic the biggest bibliographical resource on Kurdish in the world is now active at the University of Toronto, and it can obviously be traced. And I can give you a reference. I can give this to Professor Reza.
Okay, thank you. I do not know him. Professor, just another question. Could you share some insights into your current research projects or any upcoming works that you are particularly excited about that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I'm 82, and I don't think I'm going to, I don't know. I doubt whether I'm going to produce any more books. I think I've done enough in some ways. But I don't really have any particular focus at the moment on those issues. I'm still following what's happening in the European Union because I'm part of that, and I think that Brexit, removing the UK, was a disaster from every conceivable point of view. And it's the poor people in the United Kingdom who are paying for that. There are now children growing up in poverty in England after 14 years of conservative rule and mismanagement by successive conservative governments. So I do have links that, but I'm trying to help people all over the place. I have a Ukrainian who wants to do a doctorate on linguistic imperialism at a Polish university. And I'm in contact with him, for instance. And another thing I've just spent quite a lot of time on in the last 2 months is that the Maoris have expert scholars now in Maori affairs locally, but there is a newish right-wing government which is trying to limit the legal rights of the Maori minority population to using their language in public services, meaning in ministries and in education. because the government is people with a British New Zealand background who think that English is the only language that matters in the modern world, and that Maoris shouldn't bother, shouldn't assert their legal rights. And because there was a treaty made between some chiefs of the Maoris and the English invaders in 1870, they do have the right in a tribunal to challenge the government. And I wrote an expert witness statement, which is a legal term for a legal document, because at the tribunal, Maoris are trying to reassert their rights. And they had 5 days with people complaining about injustice, with 4 judges present. 2, I think, are of British origin and 2 are Maori, and with a lawyer defending the government, the Crown, as they call it, which I think is a bit comic, coming from Great Britain originally. But I mean, I could follow on YouTube, the link for the full 5 days of the function of this tribunal. This was linguistic justice in action. It was democracy in action, which is extremely pleasing, because democracy is in trouble worldwide. It's not working very well in the United States or the United Kingdom or France or Germany at the moment, for a whole mix of reasons. And the war in Ukraine and Gaza is not helping, to put it. No, I mean, no, it's tragic what's happening in those parts of the world, as well as in other ways in other parts of the world. So, I mean, there are huge numbers of issues where language policy is relevant, so that me cutting back is not happening at the moment. But I don't have any big writing project. I mean, it would be perfect. My wife and I mean, you may not know, of course, that she unfortunately, tragically died a year ago. But I mean, she and I wanted to produce a small book on linguicism, because this has never been done. And it should be a small book for the general public, not just for specialists, because clearly a lot of our writing, I mean, the Handbook of Linguistic Human Rights has 7 or 8 chapters by lawyers. It has lots of different people with different specializations, because the topic, linguistic human rights, is relevant in any number of disciplines, and those disciplines come together in a handbook to show that show how things can be addressed from different theoretical perspectives, but also with lots of case studies of countries in which linguistic human rights are being not observed, and another section of the book which is case studies of countries where linguistic human rights are being respected successfully. And that means that it's trying to bring a lot of information together. The book, by the way, will hopefully be in paperback by the end of this year, which will reduce the costs for university libraries, for instance, or for university libraries to buy access to individual chapters. Hopefully, I'm literally in negotiation with the publisher at the moment to try to ensure that this was done, because when my wife and I were asked to produce this book, having produced 4 volumes on language rights for Routledge 5 years earlier, we basically insisted that there should be paperback version of the handbook 2 years after publication of the book, and it was published in November 2 years ago. So there's plenty to keep me going, but
Okay, thank you.
It depends on too many factors, because there are too many existential challenges which I get asked for help with, and it was very stimulating to be able to speak to a new audience here.
That's great, Professor. Just the last question, Professor. What advice would you give to young scholars interested in pursuing, research in linguistic imperialism and language policy?
What could you say that again, please?
What advice could you give to young scholars?
Yeah. Well, you should read everything on it. Meaning there are short summaries of linguistic imperialism on websites. And I think if I haven't put them, if you go to my wife's website, meaning her, Reza knows her name, but I mean, basically her website, Tova Skutnab Kangas, org, O-R-G, has vastly more material that can be downloaded than my own website, because I still have an institutional attachment to Copenhagen Business School. So I use their website for my material, and they have a lot of my stuff, but not nearly as much as my wife on her website. But I mention that because there are summaries of linguistic imperialism and linguicism on her website. Some of them by her, some of them by me. But otherwise, I can send summaries, which are really a starting point for an overview. But on the other hand, clearly there are challenges in all local contexts. So one should read globally and think locally, and try to formulate a manageable topic, which one can do in a modest way in an MA thesis, and this has been done, or in a more complex way in a doctoral study.
Okay, that's great, Professor. Anything else that you like?
I think it's great. I think it's great that people are thinking that this is needed, because yes, it can be done.
Okay, thank you. Just the last question I see here just the last question, Professor. After careful examination, I came to conclusion that learners seem to be deeply confused amidst the imperialistic conflict about what drives them to learn English. They simply have given up a post-colonial literature and are willing to surrender to the inequalities imposed by Western society. So again, will linguistic imperialism ever end, Professor? Because as we talk, and as you have mentioned in one of your articles in 2012, linguistic imperialism is still growing.
Yeah, the quick answer to that is that any language can be used for good purposes or bad purposes. And that means that one wants to make sure that English only serves good purposes and is not functioning in a linguist or linguistic imperialist way. And obviously English, I'm happy to use English now because this is logical in your context. And that means that, as I say, the language itself is not corrupted. It is uses of the language which are inappropriate, which one needs to combat.
Okay, thank you, Professor Phillipson, for sharing your invaluable insights on linguistic imperialism and its implications. Your perspective has been enlightening and thought-provoking, of course. I have had the honor of having Professor Phillipson on my journal, International Journal of Society, Culture, and Language, for 13 years. Of course, that's a privilege for me. We appreciate your time and expertise in discussing these critical issues. To our viewers, thank you for joining us. Please feel free to leave any further questions or comments for Professor Robert Phillipson below. Thank you again, Professor Phillipson, and let's say goodbye.
It was a pleasure to be with you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.